I'm Joe Cerami. I'm the Director of the Public Service Leadership Program here at the Bush School. We're delighted today to have two local public servants to talk about their role in government and politics and in public service. James Edge is a good friend of mine. We've been in the Ryan Rotary Club together. We bonded during the Texas Trash Off and other great Rotary events. Thank you. James wants everybody to know he's a native Texan and a fourth-generation Brazos County resident. He also has 3 boys, and we hope they're all going to come to the Bush School someday. Doug, Matthew, and James. James is the Deputy District Director for Congressman Flores from our district right here locally, and he's going to talk to you about his role in local government. With him, of course, is his staff's better half, Miranda Russ Henderson. Miranda was Bush School, or is a Bush School graduate, class of 2011. She was always very active in public service organization and graduated with an MPSA degree and went directly to work for Congressman Flores. Her title includes being a caseworker, which puts you into direct contact with constituents and citizens of the Brazos Valley. And she's also a grant coordinator. So a couple of different points up front to make. One is I'm going to ask them to give a rundown about what they do and their topic to talk about bipartisan leadership and service in a partisan environment. So about the details of the kind of work they do in the congressional office in the district. And then also broader questions about leadership and government. What's the nature of local government in this day and age? How does a Congress member try to make themselves relevant in a very difficult environment? And then, if they consent to it, some tough questions about the issues facing all public officials today, both politicians as well as government workers, and things that are relevant to Texas, things like immigration, things like race relations, and the whole host of issues that face the national government and have made things like homeland security and some of the other issues that you guys are studying very relevant today. Did I mention healthcare? Healthcare too. So without any further comments from me, I'll turn it over to our guests, and then we'll have about 15 minutes of their talk, and then we'll open up to Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Thank you. I'm going to go first real quickly because I just wanted to acknowledge we got a couple of our former Bryan staffers here in the audience. So anything we say, Kristen and Shiloh, anything we say, they can correct. If there's anything we say that turns out maybe it's embellished or it's untrue, they can probably help you with that. As Joe said, we work in the Bryan office for Congressman Bill Flores. The Congressman Flores represents Congressional District 17, which basically encompasses everything from McLennan County up in Waco, all the way to Brazos County, to the east as far as Freestone, Limestone, and Leon County, on down. We have a small little gerrymandered snake that gets us all the way to Travis County, and so we have about 140,000 people in the Pflugerville area. We've divided into 3 district offices, the headquarters being in Waco. We have another satellite office in Pflugerville, and we have what we like to call the home office in Bryan College Station. Home office because the congressman lives here. And so he comes back home every weekend. He does not stay in Washington, D.C., except when Congress is in session. So we get to see him a little bit more than most constituents get to see their member. Our office is a nonpartisan office. We are not involved in the political aspect of Congressman Flores' existence. We are here as a constituent service office. We are also, you can't help but delve sometimes into the political, because if a constituent has questions, they expect answers. So sometimes we have to delve into that, but it's not the primary focus of our job. So I'm going to let Miranda explain a little bit more about what she does.
Well, so my role as the caseworker and grants coordinator, about 90% of what I do is on the casework side. This is working with constituents that are having a problem with a federal agency. Here in this area, it's mostly the VA, Social Security, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and a little bit of Department of State are our top 4 agencies, and then Department of Defense after that. So my Bush School education really prepared me well for that, because I've got a better understanding of how these federal agencies operate themselves, how their programs affect constituents, and I'm better able to explain some of these intricacies to our constituents. So it's a really rewarding job. We've gotten to help a lot of people with some really meaningful, in some really meaningful ways, and so it's rewarding for both of us. And it's hard to believe that it's been almost 4 years since I graduated from the Bush School, and I hope you guys are enjoying your experience as much as I enjoyed mine. So James kind of touched about our topic today, which is bipartisan leadership and service in a partisan environment. We wanted to focus on this because the reality of the situation is that we are different from federal agencies, and that we do have a partisan context. Our boss, therefore us, we are subject to the elections every 2 years, 2 elections, primary and the general election. So we serve at the pleasure of the congressman. The congressman serves at the pleasure of his district. Aside from that, there's a partisan context in that philosophy is something that guides a lot of the decisions that are made, both in our office and of course up in Washington, D.C. But we wanted to really focus on our role, which is much more bipartisan, in that we serve everyone in this district, everyone in this country, you could say, regardless of the partisan aspects to it. So we've kind of broken this down to 3 points. We'll try to keep it not too boring and not try to get too off in the weeds. But our first point, well, I'll let James talk about. The first point talked
Well,
about.
primarily we represent, the CD17 is roughly the same size population-wise as every other district of the 435 districts that make up the House of Representatives. About 700,000 people, plus or minus. Of those 700,000 people, I think it's a fair statement that ours is a major, or not major, but a majority Republican district. Not as much after redistricting, but it's still generally a Republican district. But regardless of that, we still represent thousands, tens of thousands of Democrats, maybe hundreds of thousands of people that may not see it exactly the way we see it. We remain committed to serving those constituents just as well as the constituents that agree with us wholeheartedly and that support us, however they choose to support us. It is one of the things we do in a district office. We represent the congressman when he's not in the district, and then often we accompany him and assist him when he is in the district. When he's not in the district, we serve as a conduit from our constituents, for our constituents to be able to communicate with their member of Congress. And Shiloh and Kristen remember this. There's a variety of different ways we go about this. There's calls that come into the office, we get emails, we get letters, we get faxes, and the member of Congress is always wanting to know what the people back home are thinking. Like I said, Bill, if you don't mind, we'll call him Bill. He likes to be called Bill. Bill likes to be, he comes home, so he's a little bit more in touch with his district than some members, but there's always, you're never going to have that same feel for what we have when we interact with constituents every day. We've had some recent issues related to some controversial legislation, some controversial decisions, whether it be the Speaker of the House, whether it be the omnibus spending bill that took place a few months back. There's always things that individuals and constituents are fired up about. And what we have to maintain, we have to continue to recognize that while there are certain people that are vocal, sometimes very vocal, we have to keep in mind that that doesn't necessarily mean that they represent a majority. They might represent 100% of the calls that we receive on a specific issue. And I'll give you an example. The Speaker of the House, in January, once Congress reconvened, the Speaker of the House, along with other leadership positions in the House, came up for a vote within the House. We probably got more calls during that 3 or 4 day period than we've received in a very long time. And I think in our office we got 70 or 80 calls in a 2 day period. They were 100% anti-Boehner. And they were probably, of the anti-Boehner, there's probably 95% were pro-Louis Gohmert. So that tells you that, I mean, if you simply took that into account, you would assume that Louis Gohmert has overwhelming support as a candidate for Speaker of the House. Well, I don't mean to be criticizing Congressman Gomer. He's a great guy. He's an Aggie. But he spent a great deal of time campaigning for this. He came along on the Saturday before the election. He had Sean Hannity promoting him pretty much 24/7 for 48 hours. And when the vote came, he got 2 votes. 3 if you include himself. But he got 2 votes. And that serves as an illustration that, you know, what seems to be is not necessarily always the way it is. And so we have to take into account not just the phone calls we receive. We also have to take into account when we're in town, and I see people at Rotary. Because the truth is, when we see people in the community, oftentimes we're getting a very different message from the message that we get from the people that call in, because they're more motivated typically, they're a little bit more agitated frequently. So we have to try to filter the message that ultimately gets back to the congressman.
I'm going to jump in here real quick because James's job is to be out of the office more often, and my job is to be more in the office. So I like to say James was getting a better feel of the actual district, whereas I'm getting the small percentage that are very, you know, the activists who spend a lot of time calling in and writing letters. And sometimes it's really hard to remember that with the speaker's election was a great example. Was we tallied up the number of calls across every office, and one person said, so in other words, that's 0.06%, I think, of the district. And it's hard for me, especially, to remember that that's not representative of everyone in our district, because when that's all I hear all day, I'm thinking maybe these people really are, maybe that is representative. And sometimes I even go home and I tell my husband, like, I don't know what I would advise the congressman to do in this situation, because, I mean, not that he's asking me personally, but but if he did want to know my opinion, you know, sometimes I would have to tell him, well, most of our calls are going this way, and, you know, maybe that's the way to go. And, you know, my husband will say, well, you just have to remember that that's not the average person who's contacting you. And I think that's going to be the case in any kind of government role, any really job period, where people you interact with aren't necessarily always representative of your constituency as a whole. And so it really takes you really have to make an effort to remember to keep in mind everyone, even the ones who don't, because sometimes people don't have the ability to call you. They don't know how to, they don't know how to get in touch with you. They don't have the time to call you. That doesn't mean that they don't have opinion or that their opinion is less important. And so you have to kind of find some creative ways to gauge opinions in other ways, and also keep in mind what is best for the country as a whole. And
yeah, you know, the truth is, we as you might imagine, we believe in smaller government. There's a lot of things, it's frustrating to us, and I'll give you an example. VA casework is probably 70% of all the casework that Miranda does, and the casework we do in the district. It shouldn't be such that individuals that serve their country have so much difficulty to either get questions or get answers to questions, or to get the benefits that they have due. But thankfully, our congressional offices are here to provide that service, whether it be the VA, whether it be IRS. But there's times when it's just, you really wonder, should that be necessary? We as Americans should be able to lead our lives however we choose to lead our lives. We shouldn't have to be plugged into CNN or MSNBC or Fox News every day. We've reached the point in our history and our culture where it seems like that's what we have to do nowadays to protect our interest or to keep the feet to the fire, as we hear frequently. But the truth is we should be able to lead our lives, and if we get off a hard day's work, we should be able to turn on the television and watch something that may not have to do with opinion politics. But we've reached a point now, unfortunately, where it seems like most Americans, or many Americans, enough Americans, disagree with that. But we believe that the representatives in Washington should be looking out for our interests, and that the individuals shouldn't have to be constantly engaged. But I'm afraid we've reached a point where maybe this is the wrong crowd to be preaching that to. But
well, it kind of leads into our second point. So our first point was kind of that we represent the entire district, whether you voted for Congressman Flores, whether you didn't vote for him, whether you voted at all, whether you're registered to vote. We represent everyone in Washington, D.C., and we do our best to communicate that to constituents. But kind of the second point we want to touch on is that we serve the entire district. And we serve in a variety of ways. So one thing that we do with casework casework is not something that members are obligated to do. There's nothing in the Constitution stating that a member of Congress must set up an office and hire staff to help his constituents resolve their problems with federal agencies. Most members do because they find it's, that they want to serve their constituents in that way, including Congressman Flores. But that involves working on issues that we might not personally agree with. If someone's having a problem enrolling, for instance, in healthcare through the exchanges, and it's a problem that we're able to help with, we're going to do that even though our boss is on the record as he wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act. But that's not really our place on our side of things to make that call. They ask us for assistance, and we determine, is it something, one, that we can help with? Is it within our powers? Is it within our ability? Is it within the existing laws? And if it is, then we're going to do our best to help them. So that falls along political lines of sometimes not liking what we're advocating for. That falls along sometimes working with people that are a little bit on the distasteful side. I'll give an example. I won't give too specific, but so we had a veteran who's no longer in our district, actually, who was redistricted out. So not that I had anything to do with that, but he was just kind of a pitiful old man. I mean, just everything about him was just this, these terrible sob stories. And I kept saying, well, in order for me to contact the VA on your behalf, this was the issue. He was having some kind of problems with the VA. He didn't really even know how to explain what the problems were. So I kept saying, okay, in order for me to make this inquiry on your behalf, all I need you to do is sign this release form. I'll mail it to you. You can mail it back to me, and then we're good to go. And, well, I can't even walk to my mailbox. I'm just, in such poor shape. And so James actually one day drove to his house in a different county, went to his house, got a signed release form, and came back and said, so learned some things, looked up some things, and let me back up a little bit. So the problem this guy was having was that he had been overpaid on his VA benefits for many years. He told us, I have no idea what was going on. I didn't know I was being overpaid, so now they're making me pay back $15,000, and I don't have $15,000. And there's a waiver process for that the VA determines if you're eligible for or not. And so once James came back with the release form and, said, when you're ready, let's talk about this. Well, we found out that this man had served time in jail for molesting a child, a very young child, and the next time I talked to him, he kind of even made a reference to that. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, please, I don't want to hear about this. Please don't talk about this. And it was it was a moment for us to say, okay, should we really be expending resources, our assistance to someone who's been convicted of a really terrible thing? And for all accounts and purposes, I don't want anything to do with this guy. But after we discussed it, we knew that the best thing to do is to still give him the same level of service that we would give anybody else. And in this guy's case, it was to submit his application for a waiver, and then at that point, it's in the VA's hand. The VA makes that determination. I don't think they ruled in his favor on that case, but it's our job to at least make sure he gets all due consideration that any other veteran would be given in that kind of situation. And
we do the same thing with a lot of the communication that comes through our office is just, Saturday I had a group come to the office from the Climate Change Lobby, or was it Citizens Climate Lobby, had made an appointment to come in. And I'll say this quietly because somebody probably listening. We don't believe in carbon taxes. And Congressman Flores...
Dr. Griffin's doing his best, though, on that.
He's not in here, though. So Congressman Flores ran for office on the basis of the fact that Dodd-Frank Cap and Trade had passed one house of Congress, and he recognized as a person who familiar with the energy business and the economy, he knew how devastating that would be. So the idea of coming into our office and convincing us that we're going to support any form of carbon tax or any of that, it's just, we'll be polite, but we had a nice meeting, and it was informative, and we did exactly what we promised we would do. We will pass that information on to the congressman, regardless of the fact that it's, we recognize up front that it's really not something that's going to fall. It'd be like someone coming in advocating for expanding Obamacare. It's just not going to happen as far as we're concerned, but we'll certainly be willing to listen to constituents, In fact, in this particular case, there were 4 people in the room. 3 of them were not constituents, but we still provided that courtesy of meeting with these individuals. We do that type of thing. We get personal. This morning, I was trying to send 2 emails out, and I had 2 phone calls that ended up taking from 9:30 a.m. until literally I had to tell them we've got to be at the Bush School. So here a few minutes ago, and they were both individuals that had read things online, and they wanted answers. And unfortunately, sometimes constituents will not accept your answers, or your answers are not good enough. We could disengage, or we could try to do our best to explain as best we can, not only the congressman's take or the congressman's position, but we can also try to explain what we believe to be the case. Sometimes that ultimately results in you getting into a little more political discussion when you may not want to do that, but we feel like it's pragmatic that we explain to people that, for instance, might want something done that's not possible, to explain to them why, in fact, from a political perspective, that is not possible. You know, we've got very specific political realities on the ground, and we can wish that they weren't so. We could govern by wishful thinking, or we could govern based upon the way things actually are. And the way things are right now, even though the makeup of Congress changed after the last election, it is still by no means such that any one party can run the table. And so whether it's individuals that want everything undone that's happened in the last 6 years, or individuals that want, expanded taxes, regulation, so on and so forth, we're in an environment right now where there's basically nothing happening. I mean, a gentleman that I was actually speaking with as I tried to get out the door, basically just kept telling me, Flores hadn't done anything. Flores hadn't done anything. He promised he was going to fix all these things. He hadn't done anything. And the truth is, if you're looking at it from purely political standpoint, since the Congress, since a little more than 4 years ago, virtually all of the president's legislative agenda has been stopped. There's been nothing done legislatively. So for those people who elected members of Congress to effectively stop stop what was going on, they've gotten their wish. They've gotten nothing through legislation. They've gotten a few things from executive orders and otherwise, but there's been nothing. There's been no new Obamacares. There's been no new cap and trades, no new Dodd-Franks. But we just haven't received, and we haven't gotten enough support yet that we can truly roll back any of this stuff. So it's our job to try to help communicate that to constituents and non-constituents alike sometimes, and to do it in such a way where you're not crossing the line from constituent service office to a political office, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so we kind of look at it as we're an outlet for them to express their First Amendment rights, and we want them to be able to do that. And we just try to provide high levels of constituent service to every person who contacts our office, walks in the door, calls. Not much more that I've been more proud of than when I've got someone on the phone who ends the conversation by saying, well, I really don't agree with anything you've told me or anything your boss stands for, but I really appreciate that you've given me, respect. You've let me have my say. You seem to understand the issue. That's always nice to hear when they acknowledge that you do know something of what you're talking about. Because sometimes you get it, you're an idiot, and they yell at you and hang up. So I guess that's one place we do draw the limit of constituent services if someone's being rude or threatening or abusive. So we do reserve the right to cut it off, but
there seems to be a thought, and I
so.
think it might be, I'll leave it to others to figure out exactly why, but the advent of 24-hour news cycle and so many other things that have resulted from the internet and so many social media outlets where you can say things and be anonymous, the level of discourse seems to be on the decline. At least the level of civil discourse seems to be on the decline, and it is something we see daily. And there seems to be I think back to some of the things back in the 60s, the late 60s, these protest movements and the burnings and the riots and things like that. Well, the truth is, some people seem to think that's how we get things done. You got to yell, you got to scream, you got to threaten, and that's the squeaky wheel gets the grease. It's been my experience, it's been my observation that for the most part that's not true. a level of civil engagement, from our perspective at least, goes much further than screaming and yelling and threatening. One of the things that we always refer to, because people ask, well, does it really matter if I call the congressman? Does he really listen? Does he read the emails? And the truth is we do. Now, he doesn't necessarily read every email. He doesn't read every comment. But we compile different things for him so he knows what people are thinking and talking about. But there's one specific example that where, for instance, if you came in, you could have 1,000 people call and say, we want to extend Obamacare. Well, the congressman's got a philosophical disagreement with that, and it's not going to change. The way to change that is to get rid of Bill Flores as your congressman. Having said that, there are other things that are for instance, he might not be so invested in. And one of them came about 2.5, 3 years ago. We started getting calls on something called SOPA. Now, how many of you have heard of SOPA? The Online Piracy Act.
CISPA was another name
yeah.
for it, I think. I think the same version.
Well, this was so far off of our radar screen that we weren't even thinking about it. We received literally 0 calls district-wide over this, but all of a sudden we started getting calls from Aggies. A few calls from some students, a few calls from some faculty, and we start looking into it. Well, turns out the congressman had actually, I believe, co-sponsored an early version of this because of another member that he respected had asked him to. It was actually sponsored by a Republican Texas member, the original legislation. And we started hearing from constituents. Well, we were only hearing from constituents that were against this legislation, so it allowed the congressman to kind of revisit it and look at it and think, okay, well, maybe I need to look at it a little bit more closely. And the combination of activism amongst the citizens, the constituents, who were, like I say, these people were not calling and threatening. They were calling and informing us. I think before the end of the week, the congressman had withdrawn his co-sponsorship, and ultimately, it never even came up for a vote. The same type of thing was happening kind of nationwide. But it was a perfect example of the type of engagement that actually made a difference. And I'm glad to say, even among our other district offices, no one was calling about this except for the office here in Bryan College Station, and it made a difference. And that, in addition to obviously some other members, ultimately killed that bill, which turned out to be a really, really bad bill. It was as good, well-intentioned as many of these bills are, but in practice, it was going to basically, I think, YouTube and some of these other online portals were going to be held civilly liable for a lot of the content that's being put on there. It would have shut them down. And that was not the intent, but once you dig into the unintended consequences, dig into the weeds, that's what we realized was going to happen. So that was a good example of when the constituents really made a difference.
Can we start questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, we've gone over 15 minutes, so.
Okay. No, it's all fascinating to me. So let me get the leadership word into the discussion. So what's political leadership, and how is it manifested by you two in the way you do your jobs, as well as by the congressman in trying to interact? Is political leadership different than what we think of generally as leadership, as you might have studied it here in the Bush School?
Yeah, I think so, because at the base of your decision making is your philosophy. When you're working in a political context like this, but I think a lot of the lessons of leadership absolutely apply across. One of the best lessons I learned about my leadership style at the Bush School was the importance of really getting to know the people that you work with. I remember some of those group projects that were really awful to work on. And I remember one day kind of just being real upset. One of my classmates just could never come to any of our evening meetings. And then I can't remember if a professor told me this or another student, but someone said, well, he's got a family. He's got kids he needs to be home with at night. And that was kind of the clicking moment for me, is like, oh, well, he's got other priorities that are important to him. And those aren't necessarily any more important than my own priorities, and I need to respect that. And once our group became friends with each other outside of the project, it became a whole lot easier to work together and try to get some things done. And I think that's something that's kind of suffering in, I could maybe so bold to say, that's kind of suffering a little bit in Congress, is I don't think there's as much camaraderie between members of Congress, especially across the aisle. And so I think there's a little bit less incentive to try to work together, in addition to just the fact that they are not staying in Washington the way they used to, but also the rise of the 24-hour news networks. It's become so polarized. I'll say in our specific district, our primary election is much more worrisome to us than the general election. We haven't had a tough one so far since we came into office, but we take a lot more abuse, a lot more flack from the far right than we do from the left in our district. And knowing that we have to balance both our base and the general population it's a tough line to walk, and one I'm not always wouldn't be very good at doing, I don't think. So
Yeah, leadership means different things to different people. To some people, leadership is getting up and making a speech and getting people riled up. To other people, leadership is actually gaining the respect and the help of your colleagues in order to actually achieve an objective. And perhaps there's a little bit of both. The truth may be somewhere in the middle. But the fact is, my background is not in government. If the Bush School had been around when I was younger, I would have loved to come through this. It just would have been the greatest thing. My background, though, is in business and most recently real estate. So when the Congressman hired me, my perspective was very much that of a layperson. It has really been educational for me to see how the process works versus especially how I thought the process worked prior to me working in this field. The truth is, there are people, when I hear people bashing members of Congress, when I hear people bashing staffers of Congress, they need to pay Obamacare just like everybody else. Well, the truth is, there are so many great young people working very, very hard for very little money in Washington, D.C. They're there because they're dedicated, they're extremely bright, extremely talented. You'll never hear, I don't care if it's Sheila Jackson Lee's staff or Ted Cruz's staff. There are people that are working very, very hard and doing what they think is right. And it is sometimes a little disheartening when you see the work, the very hard work. And I tell you, the phone calls I took this morning, like say, Flores isn't doing anything. Well, just because he's not on Fox News screaming and calling people names doesn't mean that he's not doing something. Working very hard. Congressman Flores was elected as the chairman of the Republican Study Committee last fall, late last fall. Was it last fall or was it January? November. The reason he was elected to this position, about 170 of the most conservative members of the House. They had 3 other choices, and Congressman was elected after actually entering the race very late. The reason he was elected, I can tell you, it's not because, as he was accused of, it's not because John Boehner was twisting arms. Just to the contrary, as a matter of fact. Members of Congress recognized that he was a very pragmatic, a very reasonable person who was not going to spend all their time throwing bombs, but he was going to be working to try to achieve a desired objective, to move the ball forward. And if that meant moving the ball forward 3 yards at a time, then at least we were moving it forward. And so as a result, he gained the respect of his colleagues. And I would, as a constituent, I would rather be represented by someone, not to be a cheerleader for my boss here, but I would rather be represented by someone who can gain the respect of his colleagues and actually have some influence, rather than someone who might be a darling of certain TV networks who literally can't get 2 votes. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm gonna jump back to a point he touched on. It might be getting a little bit away from the question too much, but James touched on kind of I call it the demonization of the public sector employee. And if you guys haven't already seen that, you will if you go into public service. It's very disheartening for me, of course, because I know my intentions are good. I didn't come to the Bush School because I wanted to, make lots of money or be a crooked person. I came because I wanted to be a public servant, and I wanted to make a difference. And I know that's all of you guys sitting in this room. That's how you guys all feel too. And so I just hope that once you guys get out there, if you haven't, like I said already, I hope you guys will remember, what you came to the Bush School for, and know that not everyone feels that way about public servants and government employees. And even if they do, you know what you're there for. And just remember that. And hold on to those ideals that brought you here in the first place, and don't let the haters get you down. So, but like I said, it is disheartening to see people just absolutely ripping on government employees. I don't like people telling me, or they've never told me directly, but they make the insinuation that if you're a government employee, it's just because you couldn't make it in the private sector, and you're just a leech. And I've had people basically claim that our salaries belong to them, and just don't let that get to you.
It's
if you start
sometimes tough to go to
getting
the
that.
office knowing every phone call is going to be, I pay your salary.
Yeah. So whatever, I pay my salary too.
We got some questions.
Yes, in the background.
Hello, my name's Betty Stanton. I'm the second year. I'm about to enter that wonderful world of public service. My question is, it seems like it's difficult to balance your leadership role in an office. Like Congressman Flores is your leader, but he also has to lead in Congress, and he's also leading constituents, and they all have conflicting desires. So at what point does he just sit back, and you may not be able to answer this, but to make the decision that, okay, I have to go on my own personal belief because the conflict is too much. And because you're leading 3 different directions, and that decision can influence how you can impact Congress, it influences how you can affect your office, and it influences your elections.
Well, from our perspective, first and foremost, obviously we go with the member. If we're not going to do anything or say anything that would conflict with Congressman Flores' philosophy, beliefs, his stated record or his stated policies, and so that's got to guide us, number one. So even though there might be times when we want to engage, there might be times when we want to engage an individual on a personal level because they might be rude or ugly. We've got to keep in mind, that this is we're representing the congressman first and foremost. We're representing the congressman, so we do what we can to, I guess in the worst case scenario, we just put all the phones on hold and then go back in the coffee room and sit for a few minutes. Just kidding, that doesn't actually happen.
Well, and then you talked about kind of the different directions that, for instance, the congressman is pulled in. I'll take the credit for that. That's having a good staff. Knowing how to, for him, he can't possibly be involved in every decision that comes before one of his offices, and so we're grateful that he places a great deal of trust and competency in us to do as we see best, not just us, but other staff. There's delegation of duties, and everyone kind of is able to become an expert on, in my case, it's an expert on the constituent services side. Our DC office becomes more expert on the policy side. So honestly, at this point, if you ask me about some of the intricacies of policy making, I'm not really going to know how to answer some of those because I'm dealing more on the post-policy side, you could say. But surrounding yourself with good people, I think that's a good leadership lesson.
Which we've had some, speaking of good people, like I said, we've got a couple of our former interns from our Bryan office here today. We were in D.C. about 3 weeks ago, and we had a little reunion. We've had a remarkable record in our Bryan office of our interns going up to Washington, D.C. and having ultimately successful careers up there working in a number of different roles. So we're very proud of the record. I think we do better in Bryan than we've done in our other district office as well, as placing people in D.C. And I don't know if there's anything, certainly nothing I do. I think Miranda does a much better job of teaching and assisting our young people. But we do. You have to surround yourself with good people, and like I say, you have to keep in mind, it's really not a conflict when you look at it. You're serving the congressman, and you're serving the constituents. Clearly, there's not always going to be an agreement between those two. But I don't think it really puts us in a position of conflict, although, there's times when it can be.
Yeah, I mean, some of those casework matters.
Yeah, that's, and we have, there's people that have never and will never vote for Bill Flores that are very, very grateful and thankful for the assistance that they've gotten through our offices because, that's, like I said, that's our job, and we do it regardless of your political affiliation. I had a gentleman came into our office 3 years ago, and he was very surprised because he had been in another member of Congress office, he tells us, and they effectively told him that unless he was a contributor, then they weren't going to assist him. And I don't know if that ever happened. That's what he told us. The very idea of that, I cannot even imagine. I can't imagine it. That crosses so many lines.
Yeah.
So many lines. Even if a person campaigned against you, the very idea of rejecting assistance, but the idea of soliciting a political contribution, I mean, not only is that unethical, it's highly illegal. So hard to imagine that happens, but he stuck with that story. So.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Just a small question as far as I guess the logistics of campaigning, and I know that you mentioned that y'all's main office stays away from political matters. What I'm interested in is that how much of the coordination goes between your 3 main district offices and the DC office, maintaining not only speaking engagements, fundraising dinners, or fundraising events, but also trying to be coordinated with the major issues that you're experiencing with casework in various district offices. So with each campaign stop or each constituent encounter, whatever issue the congressman's trying to push, not only express that he's still in touch with current issues as well as national issues, but that also can have a return on investment in the immediate matter of making sure there's enough money in the war chest to go to bat in that big primary battle that may be 6 months away or 18 months away. So I'm just interested in what's the coordination with the political campaign, policy, casework, interaction between all of your offices and the DC office all at once?
Well, it's very interesting because, truthfully, there's some campaigning, there's some political aspect to everything we do. My job, as I see it, is to assist the congressman. I want the congressman to do well. I want it to look good. I want, if we do our jobs right, then that's what happens. Ultimately, that might benefit in a political way. The fundraising end of it, not so much. Literally, you can't even bring a check into our office. We don't handle money. We don't deal with money. We don't ask for money. If there's been a time or two when a check has actually been mailed to our office, and it's like it's radioactive. You don't want to touch it.
Yeah. I put it in my purse until I see the boss's wife. And
yeah, it's we're very, very clear to draw that distinction because it's a legal distinction as well as an ethical distinction. But having said that, for instance, we had a number. The congressman was in the district last week. We had a number of in-district events, everything from a renaming of the VA facility in Waco after Dory Miller. We had a museum Friday night here in Bryant, an event where they were a fundraiser for the African American Museum of the Brazos Valley. And while these types of things are not political, it's hard to argue that they don't have some political consequences. Our schedule, we have 2 people on our staff that basically are allowed to touch the political realm of what happens, and that's our chief of staff in Washington and our scheduler. Because we only have one scheduler, that scheduler has to schedule both political and non-political events. There are some members that will have 2 schedulers, a political and a non-political. The problem is those 2 schedulers then have to interact, so there's always going to be a little bit of an overlap there.
So on our calendar, for instance, it will say just a block that says political event with no details, anything like that. So sometimes when we're getting questions from constituents about it because they know about it, and we're kind of like, don't actually have the answers to those questions, so here's a phone number where you can get some answers.
That's right. And Miranda works the casework. She's given much more autonomy. The DC office really doesn't have a lot of individual input on the casework end of it. So Miranda and other caseworkers, they work a little bit more independently. So there's a fairly significant separation between the DC office as it relates to what Miranda does, but then again, she's constantly in contact with many other federal agencies and offices and such, but she does get a lot more independence than the rest of us, it seems like.
So one scheduler maintaining the DC and district?
Yes, believe it or not.
And some members do that differently. Some members have a DC scheduler and a district scheduler.
And she's one of our former Bryan office interns
She
too, by
is.
the way. So
There was another hand.
I think you have a
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about the SOPA-CISPA PUPA issue and how that may have affected, if it did, your awareness and reaction, and the Congressman's awareness and reaction to the net neutrality issue that's popped up recently, right?
Right. Well, and that's another good example. To be honest with you, the sad thing about net neutrality is if you poll 100 people about net neutrality, you'd get 100 different ideas of what they think it is. And one of the FCC commissioners came to the Bush Library, I think in October of last year, and he had they had kind of a forum where they had, I think, 3 or 4 people, 3 people on one side, 3 people on the other. They had pros and cons. They allowed questions from the audience. Very, very informative. Congressman Flores was there. And you know, there are certain things that guide you. For instance, if the current administration thinks it's a good idea, it's time to, we need to investigate. We need to really find out whether or not it's a good idea. So there's certain little things you can use to you know,
That was a
jog
little
your.
partisan.
But having said that, you know, net neutrality is a bipartisan issue on both sides. There are Republicans that are for it, Republicans against it, Democrats that are for it, Democrats that are against it. It's something that potentially could be a huge, huge thing in this country. You think about the one entity in our economy, in our culture, that's really rapidly expanding, it's growing, it's free, it's open, and what do we want to do? We want to regulate it. You know, that just doesn't sit well. Well, what I was going to say is it is, you know, this is something the member of Congress needs to hear from people about. Obviously, we've got some idea. The congressman is a free market guy. He, you know, generally speaking, if it doesn't need to be regulated, we don't. The idea of regulating things for the sake of regulating them it's not something we typically want to be a part of. But like I say, there are people that are on both sides of this issue that are well-meaning, thoughtful people that the congressman respects. So he does need to hear from his constituents. I can tell you that we have had a number of comments from our constituents, and they're for the most part pretty overwhelming. The good thing about this is you've got some folks that are on the other side of the political spectrum that recognize the value of a free and open internet. On the other hand, you've got, I don't know if any of y'all attended the forum they had with the FCC commissioner, but there were a number of people that in the audience that believed, and some people on the dais that explained that net neutrality meant cheaper, faster, more available internet. And when it really comes down to it, you know, it's our job to try to cut through that. And thankfully, we have a very, very capable staff in D.C. You know, we basically communicate the constituents to the office up there, but we've got a staff up in D.C. that has the ability to go through these things line by line and try to really interpret what they really mean. And I think from that perspective, it's going to be hard to imagine Congressman Flores supporting. He's certainly not going to support this form of net neutrality that the FCC is trying to enact basically without any input from Congress.
Rebecca?
I have a question about the casework that you have to do. I can only imagine how many cases could come through your office between phone calls, emails, letters, etc. I'm just kind of curious how you balance which ones you answer and how you answer them. I am in the Army. When I was a company commander, I mean, I had my own congressionals that I had to answer a few times. So I've been, and so many times, they were issues that had never even been brought to me. Someone just brought them to the congressman, and then the first time I ever heard about the issue, I'm getting this formal request that's sent down through my chain of command without having to respond to an issue. So I'm just curious how you balance, which ones you answer and which ones you farm out for more information, especially if there's a lot coming in.
Yeah, so that's definitely a skill that I've had to learn, time management, and right now I think I've got about 65 open cases. So these are ones that at some point have been started and they haven't been resolved yet, resolved one way or the other. That's been as high as probably 75 is probably like my top at any given time. But there is, on one level, it's you balance what's the sense of urgency for this issue? Is this something that this person needs this resolved yesterday? Is this something that's going to be a life and death if it comes to some kind of medical issue with Medicare, or even like Army sometimes, that military that comes in medical issues? We can farm it out if it's not a federal issue. So that's a really good skill that I learned from I don't say skill, something that really good that I learned from Bush School is recognize the differentiations of different levels of government. So when not every request that comes into our office is something that we can help with, someone wants the pothole in front of their house fixed, you don't go to your congressman for that, and we will tell them, here's the number for your county commissioner, or your state representative if it's a state issue. So, and then we also get requests for intervening in private business matters, and we just have to tell them, I'm sorry, this is a legal matter, or this is a private business matter, and it's not our role to intervene in that. If there's any kind of federal oversight commission, something like that, or any kind of regulating agency that we can contact for you, we will. But on the really I say hairy issues, the ones that are just really like, I have no idea what you were telling me, I will say, can you write this in a letter, and then I can just pass it along. And then I have an Army one right now where she wrote about a 3-page letter with 15 different questions, and when I sent it to my Army liaison, I said, I'm sorry for this. I don't even know what this person's asking, but it's taken them a while to work through on that one. So, but sometimes in one day I'll have 5 new requests for assistance come in. I have to say, okay, which one's the most important? Which one do I need to start first? Is it because it's the easiest one, I can knock it out of the way? Is it because it's the most urgent, they need the help most immediately? Not really a good answer for that, just...
The balance. I mean, and I ask the question from a leadership perspective as well, because I think so often as leaders, we have all of these, I say these glass balls that we have to juggle all the time. And then you have to decide which glass ball you may have to let drop.
Yeah.
And to these constituents, it's a big issue, even if it seems not that big of a deal to those of us who have to answer them. But to them, it's obviously big enough to where they had to write to you all. Right. So I just, was curious how you...
So our goal is to never let a glass ball drop completely without at least giving them something to go on, whether referring them to someone else or just giving them a letter and say, we received it, but unfortunately this is not something we have the ability to help you with. But yeah, great question.
Let me ask you the last question, really hard one. So events happen in the United States and internationally that affect us locally. You have something like Ferguson in Missouri, race relations, in a really sad state in that community. You have current issues with respect to, do you call it Islamic extremism, or is it just violent extremism with respect to the Muslim community? And then you have events like we had last summer where thousands of children come across the border and have to be dealt with. Does the congressman try to reach out locally to members of those groups within the community to see how they feel about it, and to try to form some way of having an impact on the national political scene with respect to what do these events, these large events, mean for people in District 17?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I would call it reaching out. One of the things we do, like I say, we get calls about casework. We get calls about, hey, what do you think about this? I saw this on Drudge Report today or whatever. It's something the congressman has to, whether it affects us specifically or whether or not it is just something that's on people's minds, is something, the constituents need to know where the congressman is. And, we were we had several events most recently, the February being Black History Month. We've had a number of events, for instance, in Waco last week with the Dory Miller event. Dory Miller was the famous black Navy, not an officer, he was a sergeant actually, maybe not even a sergeant, but he was a cook, and he went to the helm of the I don't remember what boat he was on. You could probably tell me.
I'm not sure.
He shot down a number of enemy planes during the attack on Pearl Harbor, and he was awarded the second highest naval decoration after that event by Admiral Nimitz. Unfortunately, a few months later, his ship was torpedoed and he was ultimately killed. Never returned home. He was a Waco fellow, and we worked very hard to get this done in a very, very quick manner, because this is a piece of legislation. Believe it or not, it was not a slam dunk to get it passed, to get the renaming of that center. But to get it done, to get it to the Senate, and Senator Cornyn was very helpful in getting it pushed through the Senate, and then getting it to the president's desk, and then getting all the logistics in place where you could have the ceremony, get the signs changed, and do all of that before the end of February, because we wanted to make sure that it was done during Black History Month. And it's things sometimes behind the scenes where you're reaching out. There might be some individuals that recognize what it is we're trying to do.
Well, there are some issues where there's kind of some policy experts in our community, whether it's policy or program experts. For instance, sustainable growth rate on Medicare. Congressman has taken several opportunities to meet with physicians. I know he's done even some targeted mailings out to physicians to say, I'd really appreciate if you take my survey on all these different healthcare issues. the unaccompanied minors coming in, that was, do we have any meetings on?
The unaccompanied minors issue was very, very big
That
from our
was
perspective.
kind of close to home for
Yeah,
us
well,
because of the.
primarily because there was a move to take what was formerly the Bryan Army Reserve Center on Carson and utilize that facility as for something. We didn't know exactly what, but the GAO had come down and they surveyed this facility to use. We didn't know if it was going to be a housing facility, a facility where they're just going to process these people, but it became the local community became very concerned. Not because the local community is anti-child or anti-Hispanic. It was a worry that all of a sudden we were going to have a tremendous drain upon our resources in the local school systems and otherwise. So they began initially working with us, and we've actually been working with several entities, including Glenn and the city of Bryan, regarding that facility for the past 2 years anyway. So we're very familiar with it. But it became an issue that was tough because the truth is, it's a tragic situation where you had these tens of thousands of kids. Think about, I don't know if any of you have kids, but having your child, 400, 500 miles across the border in a foreign country they're not familiar with, it's something you have to keep in mind. You have to calculate and keep at the forefront of your mind, not just the policy aspects of it, but the human aspect of it too. And I know we Republicans are accused of not being human and not having hearts and all, but the fact is it's not necessarily, one doesn't cancel out the other.
And I think the greater immigration debate, I hope I'm not being too bold in saying this, but I think that Congressman Flores' views on it were shaped in large part from meeting with constituents, business owners, to, he kind of counted on them to help inform him about, how the visa process and the guest worker programs and that kind of thing. So something that he really values, and
Yeah.
so.
Okay, well, we're gonna have to heal up the room here. So let me say, Miranda, you and Bob Gates agree that much of what leadership is about building relationships and making sure that people understand each other.
He's a good one to follow. So.
And then James and President Bush 41 are in sync over
that.
public service as a noble calling. And you're both are in sync with our public service leadership program and the idea that leadership's about leading by example, making a difference, and trying to move the ball forward as best you can. So please join me in thanking our guests.